Welcome back, patrons. We are thrilled to be joined by our good friend, Deep State Kuba. You know his work from this show. You know his work from This is Revolution. You know his work from Sublation. It's always a good time chatting with you, friend.
My pleasure.
Well, we wanted
Next
to bring,
time over barbecue in Texas, eh?
please, friend. Yeah, I've been. I just had a big one last weekend, which was, I don't know, your presence was missed. So come down here sometime. Um, but yeah, I mean, we want to bring you back on to give folks a little bit of an update and give your perspective on what's happening right now with this Ukraine war. I mean, it's one of those things, like, some people I think follow it extremely closely, every moment, every shift. But for people who are sort of coming back into it, who know bad stuff's been happening, but it seems to a lot of people, I feel like it's been at a standstill for a while. Could you give people your general sense of where things stand right now?
Yes. So the latest big movement was on the part of Ukraine uh, through a couple of effective counteroffensives. They were able to reclaim a substantial portion of the territory that Russia was occupying, including a breakthrough in the Donbass that has shifted the front line further east, well into the territory of the Donetsk People's Republic, and Bakhmut, a crucial, uh, operationally important town at the linchpin of Russian logistics and fortifications, has been turned into a meat grinder for both sides, with constant daily fighting and terrible attrition. Uh, that has been going on for months. Looks like Russia is slowly uh, occupying larger and larger parts of Bakhmut, but they've been uh, claiming that they're days or weeks away from full control for months now. So it's a very bloody standstill. In the south, Ukraine made substantial gains around Kherson, uh, with a unilateral Russian withdrawal out of the territory that they held on the west bank of the Dnieper, for more fortified positions further east. The big news right now is that there's an imminent Ukrainian counteroffensive. In order to try to solidify their gains and set themselves up for a successful outcome from the conflict, they need to maintain the pressure that these offensives have placed on Russia, and make the narrative that Ukraine is winning this thing stick. And part of that has to do with the fact that they're almost entirely reliant on Western weapons at this point. And the donor countries, including the United States, are beginning to wonder about that blank check and want to see some results in order to justify further deployments of their resources. That's against a backdrop of weapons shortages all across NATO. I believe that several NATO countries, granted the smaller ones like Denmark, but several of them have sent all of their howitzers, for instance. Those countries no longer have heavy artillery because all of it is in Ukraine. There's been transfers of aircraft and of main battle tanks from the United States, Germany, France, I believe Italy as well. And these weapons will be the basis of that promised counter offensive, which is supposed to start imminently if it hasn't already begun. There's been attacks inside Russia on oil facilities, and most spectacularly, an alleged assassination attempt against Vladimir Putin by weaponized drone in the Kremlin. And those are the kinds of moves you make before you strike. You either you want to shut down enemy resupply, and it's great if you can decapitate leadership, paralyze the enemy before your forces hit, So even though the Ukrainians are denying any involvement, and it's possible that this was done by um, pro-Ukraine groups or anti-Putin groups outside any state sanction by Ukrainians, it's difficult to take. You know, I'm not saying that the denials are wrong. I'm just saying that they contain no information,
Mhm.
because they could be true, they could be false. No matter what, they would say this. It wasn't a successful assassination. Then you might claim credit. But if you're like, oh well, I we're not assassins, we're not murderers, we're just attempted murderers who are too incompetent to do it right. No one's going to say that. So I think that um, we can't know for certain, but I suspect that this may have been part of the kind of softening up operation ahead of a major Ukrainian strike. We'll see how successful that is. The weapons shortages in Ukraine are quite extreme. There was the Discord leak of classified documents that where American intelligence, one of the most remarkable things was American intelligence on Russian forces involved in the war was much better than their intelligence on Ukrainian forces. Um, I suspect that the Ukrainians are super tight-lipped because they don't trust NATO, um, and that they're also lying to inflate, um, to distract people from how desperate their position really is. But there's shortages of all kinds of weapon systems, and especially artillery ammunition. They have basically 2 weeks of artillery shells at their current burn rate, which was calculated pre-offensive,
Mhm.
before they just run out, right? And without shells, these artillery are, they're action figures. It's furniture, um, and there aren't large stockpiles left to draw on. The question is, how much better is the supply situation for Russia? It could very well be that Russia's prepared, ready. Their forces are they have substantial reserves because of mobilization, and that the Ukrainian counteroffensive will run into a brick wall. But we've also seen situations where the Russians get caught flat-footed and have to beat a hasty retreat. They gave up Kherson without a fight. Uh, so an attack on across the entire front, a general counteroffensive, is the Ukrainians don't have any. They don't have the firepower. They don't have the manpower for that. But they could potentially make a successful strike in one direction. And one region that um, I hear about as a particularly promising one is Zaporozhina, and that's the land bridge connecting Russia, the Russian mainland in the east, to Crimea across the Black Sea coast. The towns of Mariupol and what's the other one? Melitopol are located there. And a thrust south from Ukrainian held territory towards Melitopol seems like it could be successful if the Russians have underestimated their vulnerability and failed to fortify it. If they have, then it could get very ugly for the Ukrainians. I'm uncertain what the Russian plan is. I expect them to have to respond with a offensive of their own after the losses, the territorial losses that they absorbed. But perhaps at this point, because the Ukrainians have played off their success so much, and they've been um, taking such maximalist positions in terms of what they would expect as the outcome of the war, just hanging around in Ukrainian territory may be enough for Russia to claim a victory. While in the meantime, allegedly, there's 50 to 100,000 North Korean volunteers that are getting prepared to be shipped west to Ukraine. Um, Russians are, again, allegedly, because it's difficult to validate these types of news reports, negotiating with North Korea um, about moving arms and ammunition, Soviet era or post-Soviet Russian built exactly what they would need into Russian hands for the fight, and the potential of China to either play a peacemaker. They announced a 12-point um, framework for a potential peace deal, or to begin supplying war material, especially weapons and ammunition, uh, that would give Russia a distinctive advantage.
You're flat.
Our we the most recent time we talked about this conflict was with Carl Bayer, on the Nord Stream bombing, and just to kind of contextualize it there. But like, we don't make really either side that's very invested in this happen, because at least I'm speaking for myself, not super interested in hearing justifications for the invasion. While I'm also interested in like elaborating, like NATO policy pre this, and I'm also not interested in like prolonging a war to retake, say, Crimea. Like I look back at the Obama decision to not make that a red line as people wanted him to at the time. And I think I agree with that decision. So I'm just curious, like contextually, is there anything that like, or how do you like, I guess, think of the context of this conflict? Uh, Going back is 10 years, 20 years, 30, whatever you feel.
So I don't want to moralize the this bloody and destructive campaign. It's made both countries worse places. It's killed tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, created millions of refugees, destroyed a an area which had a great deal of economic importance and beautiful cultural sites, especially given that I'm Polish. Right, my own country's history is closely tied to Ukraine's. And for what? Right, the world has become a more dangerous place. Relations between the great powers are more strained. We're closer to a great power conflict than ever before. This is a horror and a mistake. Nobody's winning. Um, so we need to, what I would like to see is this ended as quickly as possible. And if that means uh, Ukraine wins with a successful counteroffensive, great. If that means that Russia gets its regime change and grabs a bunch of territory, if we can end this in a month, I'll sign on for practically any outcome, because the war itself is um, is more harmful uh, than even a Russian or Ukrainian unilateral victory. Ultimately, I would like to see a regional peace summit that maybe puts an end to NATO, maybe develops a new framework for European security that includes a recognition of Russian interests, because Russian interests aren't Putin based, right? They reflect the geopolitical situation of Russia as a country, and a country with a long history of invasion from the West. That This war is bad for Russia, but they always kind of in the back of their minds, like, well, at least we're not fighting on our own turf, and at least this isn't 1940. Um, so I think that we got here because of a great deal of geopolitical malpractice by allegedly the finest security leaders in especially the West. The decision to expand NATO eastward, is a challenging one. Um, on the one hand, as a Polish person, for instance, the fact that former Eastern Bloc countries are part of NATO is a huge win for their security. On the other, it was read as a highly provocative move and a diplomatic betrayal by Russians, especially since the institutions that were set up as a kind of consolation prize, things like the Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe, where Russia did have a membership, were hollowed out into useless talking shops. And the nominally the Western countries, which are supposed to be all about the rules-based international order, would happily flout international law, the UN Security Council resolutions, or any other of the elements of international statecraft that impinged on their interests. So it's a situation that this came into place because of a failure on the part of Western leadership to create a durable security arrangement in Eastern Europe, which would incorporate Russia. Instead, they thought that they could push Russia further and further to the margins, and it could stay there forever, and while gobbling up the near abroad piece by piece. And at this point, that observation is a historical note, because now there's a shooting war, and we have to deal with that reality, which is much more pressing and serious than trying to litigate who's to blame in the before times.
Yeah. No, I mean, I was just gonna ask, in terms of global reshuffling. Um, I'm curious what you make at some of the peace like deal attempts. I know you mentioned China before. Lula has gotten a lot of flack from American liberals for some of his statements, saying that he wants to pursue peace and general neutrality for Brazil. I'm curious, what you make of that. Whether it's like an interesting wrinkle, if it represents something larger other than maybe Lula sort of saying, we're not going to basically line up with like the American and like EU interests here. I'm curious if you have any sense as to what these things might represent or mean in the future.
Well, Lula's own experience with American power projection, I'm thinking specifically of Lava Jato, which
Yeah.
got him imprisoned for a significant time and handed the country to Bolsonaro ultimately. That, of course, he would favor a hands-off approach. And when you look at the states that fall into a pro-American or pro-NATO or pro-Russia orientation, basically it comes down to was your most recent brutal foreign military intervention Russian or American? And if the Russians were the ones that had their boots on your neck, you favored the Americans. Vice versa, you favor the Russians, more sympathetic towards them, which is sensible, but gets you to the second or third point in the 12-point Chinese peace plan, which is get away from a Cold War mentality.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're seeing coming back, the division of the world into camps, and the with all of the dangers that come along with that. And the emergence of voices like Lula's towards non-alignment, and Lula is a figure that I'm greatly sympathetic to, and so you hear that from him, and you're like, oh, that seems like wisdom. But Narendra Modi, who is not,
Mm-hmm.
one of our political heroes, also has a similar position to that, right? There's a geopolitical interest among these kind of non-aligned, great but not superpowers to preserve their ability to make deals with both sides, benefit from China trade and U.S. investment, etc., and to put the lid on regional conflicts like the war in Ukraine, because there's no upside to them. I would argue that there's very little upside to the West or to Russia either, but their level of investment and the competitive element here gives them a certain geopolitical interest. I was also very relieved looking at the Chinese plan about how moderate it is. Basically, if you changed around the specifics, You could see the EU pitching this as a Korea peace plan, or even a Tibet peace plan. It emphasizes sovereignty, international law, coexistence. There's sections on humanitarian, the humanitarian crisis, resettlement, reconstruction. It's a whole bunch of relatively good stuff. And China, at this point, has a somewhat mixed record. There's the wolf warrior diplomacy, which is the exact opposite of those 12 points, where I think the ambassador to the EU, or the ambassador to France, the Chinese ambassador, during a recent interview in Europe, said that when he was challenged, like, China's all about sovereignty, isn't the Russian invasion of Ukraine a flagrant violation of the most basic principle of sovereignty that you can imagine? So how could you possibly support Russia? And his response was, well, Ukraine, when it left the USSR, that wasn't legally fully validated. So Ukraine can't really be thought of as a sovereign country. In fact, none of the former Soviet states can be thought of, including like the Balts that are EU and NATO members, really have any legal claim to sovereignty, which is a breathtakingly provocative statement to make. And that was repudiated publicly by the leadership in Beijing. So that was also a bit of a relief. But I think that when you look closely at all of these actors, there's polarization within them. There is a war party in Beijing as well as a peace party. It might be a peace for now party, but there's certainly more moderate and more aggressive voices in even in states that we think of or we associate with one particular tendency. So as much as our world is going to be shaped by the conflict between powers, we have to focus on the internal dynamics of states as well. Most significantly, of course, the simmering blood feud between different political segments within the United States, right? It's unclear how that's going to end. And whatever happens there, whichever group comes to dominate the world's largest and most powerful military-industrial complex, will determine the future, not just within the U.S., but for the rest of us. It's the Americans' world, right? The rest of us just live in it.
Yeah, well, and that's why it's important. Like, I think, like, to that extent that I have interest in encouraging any action on the show, it is diplomacy. It's things like this recent Anthony Blinken to the Washington Post said he had an open attitude toward working with China on Russia. In principle, there's nothing wrong with that if we have a country, whether it's China or the other countries that have significant influence and are prepared to pursue a just and durable peace. Like, because I think, like, what you're saying is true about, like, that emboldens the diplomatic wing of any particular country, right? And when you have everybody say, no, actually it's beef, not like diplomacy, are you a pussy? Like, when you have that as the official statement, then that basically emboldens the war party of every country.
Exactly. Like, there's plenty of online comrades that think of any movement, any diplomatic effort as being horribly cringe, but the truth is it's based as fuck. And an effective diplomat, like, those are kings. But I think that we also have to look at what is going on. I was quite alarmed looking at the end of the Fulbright program connecting the U.S. with China, and moves of a kind of isolationist part on the U.S. The reality is that compared to most of its rivals, the United States has a more open society and is more welcoming of foreigners. That has been mostly good in the past because it creates more familiarity. It's easier to, if you imagine the dehumanization of Muslims and Arabs after September 11th, imagine how much worse it would have been if there were no Muslim Americans or Arab Americans to push back on it. And it was extraordinarily challenging and dangerous for a lot of them, but um, it did split opinion, which otherwise could have very easily been shaped into just a naked anti-Muslim bigotry. Um, so those person-to-person connections and the access of countries, whether it's the United States, whether it's the People's Republic of China, whether it's Russia, to contact with foreigners is the reduction in that is something that I'm also very concerned about.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, you heard about a lot about that in the lead up to World War One. I feel like there's a book that went into like Stefan Zweig. I think that's his name. I can't remember the citation. It's a book about sleepwalking into World War One or whatever, and it was all like, 30 years ago you could travel this far without showing papers anywhere, and it's like the slow roll up of those sorts of liberties. Yeah.
The world of yesterday.
No, it wasn't
Okay.
that. Unfortunately, I wish I had it, but unfortunately not. But yeah, I mean, um, anything else you guys want to touch on with regards to this? Like you said, like, and really one other thing is, people who support the invasion will often be like, well, look at what this atrocity of the Ukrainians, and then people who want like a more maximalist support of Ukraine will be like, well, look at this thing that the Russians did. And to me, this goes back to your original point of like, this is a horrible war. It's like atrocities are going to happen with this, and that's why it's important to seek a peace that's durable. And like, that's all I want to say about that.
And in this is, I mean, the war nerd reminded me of this in a recent, I think his appearance on Chapo, but great, fascinating podcast that's also worth a listen if you're interested in following these topics. That following the Nuremberg trials, within the Nuremberg framework, there was a recognition, after all, the people had just experienced war, and they didn't just know what the other guys did, they knew what they did, what they had to do. So there was a bit of a tacit acknowledgement that war is hell. People suffer tremendously, and you're forced to do odious things in order to survive, let alone win. So if there was an operational justification for something that might be like ruthless or ugly, for instance, not taking prisoners after a battle, then there was some leniency. However, this meant that the most severe, the most objectionable war crime, a crime against humanity, was aggression, was starting a war, because whoever starts it is now forcing everyone into that condition where brutality is inevitable. And we really need to recapture that notion that, like, look, there's no such thing as a clean war, or, every bombing is an atrocity, right? Every soldier, right? Every combatant that you kill is somebody's son, right? Or daughter, depending on your military. But every weapon produced is waste of scarce resources. That's straight up Eisenhower from the military industrial complex speech, that this is a hellish type of world to live in, and whoever begins the war has to accept blame for it. Now, it's very hard to litigate that question, right? Did the war start with Russian invasion, or with Maidan uprising, or did the Cold War, never end in Ukraine. But as long as the fighting will continue, both sides will commit atrocities, innocent people will suffer, and we need this to end as quickly as possible.
Absolutely. Kuba, thanks so much. We had, I guess we had a little bit of fun with the Tucker segment, which patrons look out for that on Tuesday. But it's good maybe a little bit avoidant of this, not only because it's tough to have a completely a line you feel entirely good about, but also it's tough to follow on a detailed basis, I think, and know what to trust. So I appreciate you coming in and giving your info on it, and
happy to lend you my expertise.
Exactly, from the deep state himself itself. Kuba, where can people find your work?
So I appear regularly. I'm a co-host on This Is Revolution. White Guy Wednesdays is the show with me, Gene, and Barn, and we're working on another potential line of programs that but it's a secret, right? Like you'll find out when it's ready.
It's classified.
Classified, exactly. And then also frequently on Sublation, there'll be an interview with me by Doug Lane on free speech. I have a very nuanced and complicated take. It's not just Elon good or Twitter bad.
Very nice.
And also, I'm on Varn blog, and of course, you can find me at Twitter, where I don't write anything, and then put up 2 snarky comments and 2 40 post threads.
Very nice. Kuba, thanks so much, man. Sweet talking.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it.